we want to take advantage of that and build on these 4 pillars so we can use fewer antibiotics, use the new generation of feed additives, and achieve the greatest level of success. And we came to the conclusion, Trey, it's a lot more than just taking out antibiotics and plopping in 1 or 2 or 3 new generation of feed additives.
Swine it.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Swine It podcast. I'm your host, Trey Kellner, and this might be my most challenging podcast to date, not because of the guest, but because we could probably make this a 10-part series that, would be a masterclass in 10 hours. Because today I'm joined by my mentor, Dr. John Patience, who's the professor emeritus of animal science at Iowa State University and the owner of Oxford Nutrition Consulting. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you, Trey. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be on the other side of the desk.
Yes. So for those that don't know, John hosts basically the Canadian version of this and is a great listen to if you want to catch those previous podcasts. So today we're kind of flipping this around and putting John in the hot seat, and I have the easy part today of just guiding him along this process and also trying to not make this a very, very long podcast because we could easily do that. So with that, John, let's get started. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Great. Well, thanks, Trey. So currently, as you mentioned, I'm professor emeritus at Iowa State University. I was at Iowa State for 13 years, and that followed about 21 years at the Prairie Swine Center. So I've had and before that, I worked in the feed industry. I worked in extension. So I've been blessed with working in a diversity of positions. And I would say I might be the luckiest guy that ever walked the face of this earth, because a lot of the things that I was able to do were due to serendipity or good fortune. So I'm where I am today. I'm really enjoying retirement, but I'm also still doing a little bit of consulting on in 2 general areas, generally in feed ingredient evaluation and in research management. And then I also still do some speaking in nutrition. But due to a promise that I made to my wife, it's on a limited basis.
Well, I think you do a great job of balancing that. That was going to be my first joke. For being retired, it sure seems like you're busy, but no, you've done some tremendous work.
Swine is a professional solution provider for enzymes, probiotics, and functional additives. We offer customized formulas to target nutritional issues in livestock and maximize the utility of animal feed. Find us at sunhy.com, spelled SUNHY, for more information.
So with that, let's just kind of start there. What have you enjoyed most about, not being a full-time professor and in consulting as your schedule allows and as Rebecca allows you, right? What do you enjoy most about what you're currently doing, John?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's evolving, Trey. One of the things I've learned, retirement, in a sense, it's not a job, but in a sense, it's kind of like going into a new job, because there's a learning curve, and you need to learn to manage retirement just like you learn to manage any job that you're doing. And so, for example, one of the lessons that I've learned most recently, and I've read it many times and it just never stuck, is that when you're retired, you have to have a routine. Because if you don't have a routine, at the end of the day, you find out, well, what did I accomplish today? And you don't have to accomplish anything in retirement, but you really want to make sure you're using your time well. And so what I'm enjoying the most, Trey, is a greater balance on family. Just got back from 3 weeks in Toronto, spending time with my children and grandchildren, and that's always a good time. And actually, in another week, I'm heading over to Germany to see my son, Matt, who's doing a postdoc over there. So we'll spend a week and a half in Germany. So that's part of the joy of retirement. But I also really enjoy my consulting and interacting with people that were part of my life when I was still working, good people in the industry. And I just didn't want to give that up completely.
Yeah, completely understand that. And you're doing an awesome job. So Today, we're going to try to focus this podcast into finding effective alternatives to antibiotics in our diets and basically why it's been a frustrating experience for all of us to date. But before I start that, there has been a little popular press about yourself, and that's around the NRC committee and the fact that you're the chair of that. So I thought this would be a good platform for you, John, to kind of describe, first of all, what is the NRC? And what is the intent of the NRC, right? A lot of our listeners know it as the Brown Book that may sit on their production nutritionist desk, et cetera. So what is the intent of the NRC? What's the objective of the NRC? How's that committee organized? What are you able to use, not use, et cetera? And then lastly, if you could touch base, just how exciting is it for you to be a part of and help lead that document?
Well, last question first. It's tremendously exciting and it's a massive honor. And I'm really enjoying it. NRC picks the committee. And this time they did something very different than in the past. Because in the past, the NRC committee, the swine committee, was made up of kind of the senior people in the swine nutrition community. Where this year, we have a cross section. We have the more senior people who were involved in the industry, but also some relatively new faculty members that have already distinguished themselves. And so there's this array of perspective that we're getting this time around, which I'm really excited about. The committee, it's made up of 12 people. 9 of them are from the U.S., many from the Midwest, but some from each coast as well, from the East Coast and the West Coast, so geographically well represented. For the first time, I believe in my memory, 2 Canadians that are on the committee this time, and actually a European, Jaap van Milgen, who is on the committee because he's helping us update the model. So a really diverse group. And they're just wonderful to work with. They're really committed to working together. The committee works by consensus. In other words, it's not a vote that determines what the calcium requirement's going to be. It is a consensus on, yeah, we've looked at taking it all around like a donut. We've looked at the literature. We've built this into the model, and this is our recommendation as the requirement. So it's put together by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASEM, and the NRC is part of that, and they oversee everything. They draw up the guidelines, and our job is to update the nutrient requirements for swine. And so there's one immediate, I think, misunderstanding sometime about that book, and that is it's not a swine nutrition book. It is a book of requirements. So people will say, well, why don't you talk about this, John? You talk about the requirements of the sow, but you don't talk about actually feeding the sow. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that we are mandated to focus on the requirements, and there's other sources that you can go to look at the feeding management, for example. So that's number one. But before going any further, I want to acknowledge the tremendous job of our predecessors that put together previous NRCs. And the last one, as people who are familiar will know, huge departure from previous NRC books, much more information, much more detailed, and a much more dynamic model that is included in that document, and that will be continued. So then comes the second, what I think is misunderstanding about the book. And when you look in the NRC, and we all do it, we are all guilty of this, or at least most of us are, and that is, okay, I've got a 50-pound pig. What is the lysine requirement for that 50-pound pig?
Yes.
And that is not what the NRC book tells you. The NRC book tells you that if you have a 50-pound pig growing at this rate, eating this much feed with this feed conversion, then this is our best estimate of the lysine requirement. If your pig is growing faster than that, then the lysine requirement is going to be higher, and that's acknowledged. But sometimes people will undertake an experiment and say, well, I looked at the phosphorus requirement, or I looked at the threonine requirement, and we found it to be higher than NRC. Well, actually, I would go back and look at the study, and I say, you know what? you actually agreed with the NRC, because if you adjusted for the difference in performance, you're just bang on with the NRC. And so that's the other thing, and we need to keep in mind that there is no, I'm preaching to the choir here, but there is no one single requirement for lysine or calcium or phosphorus. It is really dependent on the pig and the performance, economics, etc. And that's what we're trying to deal with as well. So that's where we're at, Trey. Wonderful committee, and we're really looking forward to living up to the expectations of our predecessors and also the expectations of the National Academy of Sciences.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, John. And I really appreciate you explaining how, I think people, especially non-swine nutritionists, might view the NRC as like a black and white table. And those numbers are static, right? That's a black and white number. And that is not the case at all. So thank you for explaining that. And best of luck as you guide those efforts, over the next period of time here, and look forward to seeing what the committee has consensus on. So
Yeah, and actually, I guess there's a couple of other points I should make very briefly, and that is
yes.
all of the discussions by the committee are confidential, and you will find out what our discussions were and our conclusions when the book comes out, and not before, because we are not allowed to talk about the internal workings of the committee. That's number one. And then number two, but there is a departure, and this is now public knowledge, that, and previous committees looked at this, and we've decided to pull a trigger on it. And we are actually going out and obtaining nutrient information on ingredients that have not been in the published in the published literature. Everything else in the NRC book is based on published literature, literature that has been reviewed by peers. But we realized that actually a lot of the data in the peer-reviewed literature is based on analyses that were done by these very same labs. And so we are inviting those labs to share their information on ingredients if they would be willing to do so.
Yeah, I think that's a great step. Definitely a great step. So cool. All right, so let's dive into our podcast focus here. And I'll just ask the question, just real simple. John, why have we been frustrated in finding replacements to antibiotic and swine diets?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's your 10-hour answer.
Yes, I'll set the clock now, right?
There you go. But seriously, and I'm going to be maybe a little bit blunt here, and that is I think we've expected too much of these additives. I think, we're looking for, people still talk about them as replacements for antibiotics or alternatives to antibiotics. And most, if none, of these alternative ingredients do the same thing that antibiotics do. So how can we expect them to achieve the same success? You take out the antibiotic and you put in another feed additive, and you don't lose anything in terms of performance, in terms of health status, and so on. I mean, that's certainly what people are working towards and doing research on and developing new products to achieve. But I really think that it's not fair to expect a plant extract or an enzyme or a medium chain fatty acid or whatever to do fully what an antibiotic has done previously. Antibiotics were pretty novel discoveries back in the 20s, were evolved into feed additives in the late 40s and 50s, and have had a tremendous impact, and we've come to depend on them. But now we have to look at it a little bit differently, and that's why Alex Ramirez and I wrote this review article, because we wanted to look into what is going on and how do we make the best of the products that are available and take full advantage of their capabilities.
Yeah. So let's dive into the review article. First of all, what prompted you to take on the project, right? You kind of talked about that to start with. And then what do you think were some key things that you learned as you were doing the review article And what do you think are some key learnings that the readers can take away from that review article, John?
Well, it kind of got started a little bit with a lot of conversations with a lot of different nutritionists. And hey, John, what do you think is this additive going to do for me, and how should I use it? And then I realized that I kept qualifying that answer. Well, if this and this and this, then this is the best product, and so on. So it's a little bit as an analogy. Let's take a look at mycotoxin mitigation. And we know quite well that if we're trying to mitigate the effect of aflatoxin, there's certain kinds of binders that we use, and but we don't use those same binders when we're trying to mitigate vomitoxin, because vomitoxin is a different circumstance. And there's products that work well in the presence of vomitoxin, but we don't use those for aflatoxin. Well, I think the same applies to a lot of other feed additives that we're looking at. They are there to achieve a specific objective. But also, what really got us thinking was a study that Alyssa Cornelson, one of your previous colleagues as a master's student, did an excellent comparison under commercial research barn situation of the effect on performance and on the net income of finishing barn based on disease challenge. She had low, medium, and high challenge. I don't have time to go into the details, but really well-controlled study. And so she could look at, well, what did disease really do to growth rate and feed efficiency and mortality? And what did it do to the bottom line? And so she had 3 barns. The low challenge barn had 3.3% mortality. The medium challenge barn had 7.7% mortality. And the high challenge barn was awful. It was 19.9% mortality. But just looking at the 8.8% versus the 7.7%, pardon me, versus the 3% mortality, the difference in net income in the barn was about $28,000. And that worked out to about $11.50 per pig placed. That's an awful lot of money. And Trey, these pigs were very well managed. They had the benefit of any antibiotic that was available and vaccine as required. And we followed the farm's standard procedures for animal medical care. And yet we still experience those losses. And we said, man, that's an awful lot of money to be left on the table. So let's step back and take a look at how we can do better. And that's how it all got started, Trey.
Yeah. So you've talked previously, John, about, kind of there's 4 pillars to success in maybe dealing with less antibiotics in your feed program, or the elimination of antibiotics in your feed program. Would you mind highlighting those for us again?
Yes. Well, the 4 pillars, Trey, is really there's diet formulation strategies, there's animal and facility management strategies, there's feed processing, and there's then the selection of appropriate feed additives. And those are the 4 pillars. And we kind of think they interact with each other in a manner that if we're going to achieve true success, we need to consider all of these pillars in addition to the standard medical treatment that we're getting from our veterinary care. And we point out that the advances in swine health medicine in the last 2 or 3 decades has been amazing in terms of their understanding of biosecurity, their management of disease, their control of disease, their treatment and diagnosis of disease. And that really evolved from, I think, specialization. Swine veterinarians are now swine veterinarians. They're not just, quote, veterinarians. But the same has applied in swine nutrition. And most nutritionists that we would work with would be specializing in swine. Some of them might be joint swine and poultry, but there's not very many of those left. And so we want to take advantage of that and build on these 4 pillars so we can use fewer antibiotics, use the new generation of feed additives, and achieve the greatest level of success. And we came to the conclusion, Trey, it's a lot more than just taking out antibiotics and plopping in 1 or 2 or 3 new generation of feed additives. That's just an unfair expectation.
Yes, yeah, it is. It is. And like, even if you just look at just the variation, as you were alluding to, John, and disease status, or even when we get down to the microbiome level, right? We all deal with variation within our production systems or research experiments or whatever that may be. But when we look at these two specific components, there's a large degree of variation, and just that single trait alone can cause frustration in trying to interpret results or repeat results, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely, Trey. That's a very, very good point. And it's tough dealing with that variation because there's
Mhm.
certain things that in your system or other people's system or in individual farms, they want to standardize things because that's the most efficient. And that is what helps us to be able to do what we do. But unfortunately, trying to standardize too much, especially among different farms, without taking into account those variabilities, can really cause us to be frustrated with
Mhm.
some of these feed additives.
For sure. So, John, at the conclusion of kind of this review and the efforts that you spent in this area, were you able to identify, and maybe this is a little too impossible, but I'm going to put this question on you anyway. Were you able to identify, hey, here's maybe 2 or 3 things that if we could figure out as a group of scientists over the next, 3 to 5 years, that this might help us advance our understanding of how best to limit our usage of antibiotics and how best to set up feeding programs going forward?
Yeah,
I know that might be a tough ask, but John, can you try for
no,
us?
no, it's a very good question, Trey. And believe me, we've thought a lot about it. You're certainly not the first guy to ask us that question. And I
Sure.
think one of them is that we really need to determine what's our objective here. And so often, and I was guilty of it when I was involved in research, we would run a growth trial. We would see if the additive gave us better performance, and we would draw our conclusion on whether that's a recommended product or not. But we're actually expecting that feed additive to do more than impact growth. We're expecting it maybe to improve gut health, maybe to stimulate the immune system. Maybe we wanted to stimulate appetite in the face of factors that are trying to suppress appetite. Maybe we want to help the pig overcome oxidative stress. And that's not all going to be revealed in that growth trial that I ran. And so I think we need to determine what is our objective with the feed additive and then take a look at that in a little bit more specific way. But also, we have to keep in mind dollars and cents. And so the question is logically asked, well, John, it's fine and dandy. It reduced oxidative stress and it did improve the gut microbiome, but it didn't give me any more money.
Mm.
And then we have to answer that question then, how much are we prepared to pay
Hmm.
to improve the gut microbiome, to improve appetite, to improve the pig's ability to resist disease. And we obviously are willing to pay something for it because we are spending money putting certain additives into our diets as we speak. And so we are prepared to pay for it. But I think we need to, and I think actually the companies that are developing these products are doing a much better job now than even 5 or 10 years ago in terms of getting an understanding of what those products are doing. What are they capable of and under what conditions, so that when you as a nutritionist have to make a decision or you're faced with a problem, you say, aha, here's my toolkit. And here's the 2 tools that I'm going to take from that toolkit. So that's number one, Trey, is we really need to define what it is we want these products to achieve for us. And then number 2, I think we need to do a better job of evaluating the products once we do use them. So that, I mean, the veterinary community is doing this all the time, right? They will recommend a vaccine, they will use a certain medication for treating a certain circumstance, but they're always looking at, well, So what? What did it accomplish? What have we achieved here? So that's number two. And then the third one, I think we have to take a bit of a longer term view when we're evaluating some of these practices or products. And I'll give you an example from Dan Columbus at Prairie Swine Center, who did a study. He was telling me about where they added, he added, I think it was tryptophan, threonine, and methionine to the diet in the nursery and looked at performance and saw nothing. But when he looked at the performance of those pigs after they got out of the nursery, he had considerably, statistically significant, better performance in the pigs that received the additional amino acid supplementation. And so I think we need to not only look at what we're trying to achieve, we need to take that longer term view of what these products might be helping us with.
Yeah. So one last thing, John, to touch on within this subject that you've always been a great advocate for is proper experimental design, right? So oftentimes research groups or researchers, and it's often due to facility constraints, right? Have a certain type of experimental design that they kind of plug and chug throughout this. As you kind of did this review article, and you've mentioned this in other areas too, how important it is to design the experiment around the scientific question you're trying to answer and the hypothesis you're trying to test. Can you kind of elaborate
Yeah.
that for our audience or, researchers that are listening to this podcast on why that's important and suggestions for them going forward?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, Trey. And I reflect back when I was in graduate school ever so very long ago, and I learned so very much from Dr. Dick Ostick. He was just an amazing mentor. And one of the things I learned from Dick is when I'm designing an experiment, I'm exaggerating only slightly when I say I should spend as much time defining the objective of the experiment
Mhm.
as I do designing the rest of the experiment. So, in other words, an objective of an experiment says to evaluate the impact of ABC on XYZ, sorry. And, that's not much of an objective. That doesn't really help me to understand what I want to do. But if we say, I want to understand the impact of ABC on feed intake, on growth rate, on gastrointestinal distress, and oxidative stress, pull something out of the air in the pig during that early post-weaning period. Well, boy, if that's what I really want to accomplish, then defining the rest of the experiment becomes really quite easy.
Yes.
And so I think that becomes important. And I've learned from other people, probably before we even drop the objective, we should write up a hypothesis. What's my hypothesis? And then really the objective of the experiment can be to test this hypothesis. And then at the end of the study, you conclude we either supported the hypothesis or we rejected it.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. I think sometimes, from my seat as whether that's a grant reviewer or reviewer of, peer-reviewed publications, or more importantly, as a swine nutritionist that's trying to use every piece of information I can to best, design a feed program as possible, where, those flaws in experimental design or trying to take an incorrect experimental design to try to solve that hypothesis or test that objective. And it can be frustrating, right? So thanks for just sharing those words and that expertise.
And there's one other trade that I'm feeling even more strongly about as I work with some organizations on research management, that when we should have a structured procedure for prioritizing our research. I don't know of anybody that has more research capability than they have studies they want to run. So at some point, you have to decide which I'm going to run this one and not that one. Well, how do you make that decision? Because there's the benefit of running one if you win, but there's also the cost of not running the other if you don't even run it. So there has to be a procedure in place, and it'll include things like potential economic benefit. What are the chances of success? How important is it to my system? What problems is it potentially going to solve? Or what opportunities is it potentially going to present to us? And then perhaps most importantly, after the experiment's done, then do an economic analysis to say, we ran this experiment and the potential in our system is to make this much more money or save this much money. And that's for our benefit. Did we do a good job of picking that particular topic? But also, we can go to the guy that writes the check for the research farm and say, look what we accomplished last year. We ran X number of studies, and if we added up all of the benefits of those studies, this is what it came to. So that's the other component of that I think is really important, Trey.
It's a great ad, yeah. So I have 4 final questions here. They're a little bit on the fun side, John, to kind of end this podcast.
You bet.
So our listeners can get to know you a little bit better. So the first of these 4 questions is, what is the biggest hurdle that you overcame in your career that you're the proudest of?
Yeah, well, I think when we started at Prairie Swine Center, that was something that was really exciting. And the key there was we had the support of the industry. And, I had a mentor at Cornell, a retired professor who took me under his wing for, I have no idea why. And he said, John, in your career, you make sure that you work closely with industry and you do the things that they want you to do, that they see value in. So at Prairie Swine Center, that's exactly what we did, and the industry was hugely supportive. So I think that's perhaps what I'm most proud of. And then the other one, which might be instructive to some of the younger people there, when I retired from Prairie Swine Center, I had no idea what I was going to do. I just knew that it was time for me to move on. Walking down the street one day, and a fellow by the name of Chuck Rhodes, who was the dean of the vet college and a former swine health veterinarian, said, hey, John, you got any plans after now that you're done at Prairie Swine Center? I said, nah, not really, not quite sure. And he said, well, Iowa State's looking for a swine nutritionist. And my jaw dropped, and I thought, oh my heavens, what an opportunity that would be. And that comes back to connections and networking.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't overstate the value of having a good network. And I know you value that tremendously in your world as well, Trey.
Oh yeah. Well, just think about if that, conversation wouldn't have occurred, John,
Yeah,
right? Think about the ripple effect, the butterfly effect. You and I may not be talking here on this podcast,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, right on. Yeah.
Who knows? Yeah. I might be a football coach in the Sand Hills of Nebraska right now or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? So,
And I might be yelling at referees at some hockey rink somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, so speaking of that, John, we are in the middle of the Stanley Cup playoffs. I would be remiss if I didn't ask, will Canadian team finally break the streak and hoist the Stanley Cup this year?
Well, Trey, who knows? I think Toronto all of a sudden has created a lot of excitement. Gone from the fans being just totally flabbergasted with their collapse to all of a sudden excited about what they've done. And we're going to have a great Game 7 between Toronto and Boston. Edmonton has got past Los Angeles for the fastest in their history. And Vancouver's still alive. Winnipeg is not. So we still have 3 teams in the works. I'm not sure. Maybe one of them might be favored to go all the way, or has expected to have a good chance of going all the way. But I'll tell you, it just shows how hard it is to win that Stanley Cup.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, one of these years it will happen in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. A little bit more serious of a note, and I'll try to keep this short and limit you to just 60 seconds, John. If you had 1 minute to talk to a new faculty member today, what advice would you provide him or her?
Yes. And if that new faculty member is an assistant professor just starting out, number one, I would advise that individual that she or he should look at what will help them get tenure, and that's what they do. And if it's not going to help them get tenure, then defer it. After you get tenure, you want to do extra teaching or you want to do extra extension work, and that's part of your dream. Well, you can do that, but initially you want to focus on getting tenure. That's the job description. So that would be number one. Number two is make sure that your first graduate student is a really good one. Because I'm proof positive that a good graduate student makes a professor look much better than they really are. And so when you're a starting out professor, you really want to have a good student or good students because they will help you in so many ways.
Thanks, John. Lastly, and then we'll let you off the hook here. What's your favorite pork recipe or dish that uses pork as an ingredient?
Yeah, that's an easy one. I mean, I have a whole bunch of them, but the one I like the most is that pork tenderloin muscle.
Hmm.
As long as you cook it well, there's not a lot of fat in there, but it is so tasty and it is so tender and it is so predictable. And
Yes.
I have a number of different marinades that I've used. One of my favorites is based on mustard, and put that on the grill. And man, that is good eating. And the pork producers listening here aren't going to appreciate when I say that. It's an amazingly inexpensive piece of meat.
Yes, it
Yeah. I'm
is. Like,
shocked at how good a quality it is, and yet it's not very expensive in the grocery store.
yeah, we probably cook one probably once every other week, and
Yeah,
same
yeah.
deal. And then if we have leftovers, we'll add some taco seasoning, make fajitas.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's just a tremendous cut. Yeah, could
yeah.
not recommend that.
Feed is a fomite for swine viruses, and studies have shown that specific ingredients matrices can enhance virus survival. Preventing virus transmissions through contaminated feed is achievable with proper protocols in place. Preventing ASF infection with the 3500 sow operation can save an operation's $60.5 million. Feed sanitation ensures that clean feed moves throughout feed production and remains pathogen-free until consumption. Both Terminate and Thineo have been evaluated against viruses and found to be effective in reducing the viral load in feed and preventing clinical disease. Contact a clean feed expert to learn more today.
John, thank you so much. As I said, we could make this a 10-part series really easy. So thanks for your time. We all wish you the best. And this concludes this episode of the Swine It podcast. They come out every Tuesday. Feel free to see us on YouTube or wherever you prefer listening to podcasts. And hope you have a great rest of your week.